My fiancée slept with a coworker, ended up pregnant, and deceived me into thinking the child was mine, until a DNA test shattered everything I thought I knew about her. I'm a 35-year-old man, and for 8 years I believed I had a strong, dependable marriage. My wife Elena and I had built a stable life together, a cozy home in the suburbs, steady jobs, and long, heartfelt talks about starting a family of our own. On the outside, everything looked just right, like we were heading toward a future filled with promise. But beneath that carefully curated surface was a betrayal that would tear everything apart. It started on an ordinary Saturday. I decided to tackle a long overdue chore cleaning out our spare room. You know the type of room I'm talking about, the one that becomes a graveyard for things you don't use but aren't quite ready to toss. Boxes of old cords, stacks of magazines we swore we'd read, gifts from people we didn't even like. It was all there, buried under a layer of forgotten memories. Elena was out doing her usual weekend routine, shopping, hanging out with friends, gossiping over overpriced coffee. With the house to myself, I figured I might as well be productive for once. As I sifted through the clutter, my hand brushed against something half buried beneath a pile of tangled extension cords and faded tote bags. It was an old external hard drive. I honestly didn't even remember owning it. Curiosity got the better of me, so I plugged it into my laptop. Most of what I found was innocent enough. Pictures from past vacations, grainy videos of us laughing when money was tight and we shared a single computer, and a few outdated downloads from who knows when. But then I noticed a folder I hadn't seen before, titled Bachelorette Memories. I want to make this perfectly clear. I wasn't snooping. The folder was in plain sight. I honestly thought it would just be some goofy, harmless footage from her bachelorette party. I expected to see the usual stuff. Drunk friends singing karaoke, maybe some risque jokes and silly games. What I found instead made my stomach twist into knots. The first video was more or less what I expected. Elena and her bridesmaids were in some hotel suite laughing and throwing back shots. They wore those tacky plastic crowns that say bride-to-be and matching sashes. But when I clicked on the second video, everything changed. It opened with a blaring nightclub scene, flashing lights, deafening bass, women screaming and cheering. And then, in struts, a male stripper dressed like a firefighter, because of course he was. But this wasn't just a goofy performance for laughs. Elena wasn't sitting back and giggling with her friends. She was front and center, grinding against the guy like she'd forgotten every promise we'd made. Her hands were all over him, and the look on her face wasn't one of playful embarrassment. It was hunger. I felt a knot in my chest. But it got worse. The video cut to a hotel room, and there was Elena lip-locked with the stripper like her life depended on it. It wasn't just a peck. They were wrapped around each other, devouring one another. My hands froze on the keyboard. I stared at the screen, completely numb. My first thought was, this has to be a joke. My second, why the hell would she keep this? When Elena got home, I didn't wait. She barely made it through the front door before I confronted her. I held up the hard drive and said, "We need to talk." She shot me one of her patented annoyed expressions, the kind she usually reserved for when I interrupt her scrolling on Instagram. "What now, Marcus?" she sighed, already exasperated. "I found some videos," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Her expression didn't change. "What videos?" "Your bachelorette party," I replied, locking eyes with her. Her face lost color for just a second, barely perceptible. Then she rolled her eyes like I had brought up an unpaid parking ticket. "Oh, for God's sake, Marcus, that was years ago. Why are you even bringing this up?" I couldn't believe it. "Elena, you cheated on me with a stripper. I saw the video." She actually shrugged, like I had accused her of leaving the toilet seat up. "It was my bachelorette party. It's not a big deal. Everyone does it." My jaw nearly hit the floor. "Everyone does it? Are you seriously trying to justify this?" She folded her arms across her chest, wearing that smug, superior look she's mastered over the years. "You're overreacting. It wasn't like I had an affair. It was one night. I was drunk. It was before we were even married. Let it go." "Let it go?" I repeated, my voice rising despite my best efforts. "You kept this from me for 8 years, and you're telling me to let it go?" Another eye roll. "Marcus, it's not like I slept with the guy. It was just a little fun. I didn't tell you because I knew you'd flip out, and look, you are flipping out, just like I thought." Her nonchalance was like gasoline on a fire. "I trusted you," I said, voice cracking. "You lied to me, for years. This isn't a small mistake, Elena." And then she went into full gaslight mode, her classic defense. "Oh, grow up, Marcus. You're being childish. That was before we even said our vows. Are you seriously going to throw away everything we've built over one stupid night?" I didn't respond. I couldn't. I grabbed my keys and walked out, unsure where I was even headed. I ended up at a park, just sitting on a bench like some sad cliché out of a drama movie. Her words kept echoing in my mind. It's not a big deal. Everyone does it. Let it go. Was I being irrational? Was I really overreacting? No, I decided I wasn't. Cheating is still cheating, whether it happened the night before the wedding or 10 years into the marriage. And the worst part? She didn't even feel guilty. That made it so much worse. When I eventually returned home, she was curled up on the couch, phone in hand, acting like nothing had happened. "Are you done with your little tantrum?" she asked, not even bothering to look up. I said nothing, just walked past her, went into the bedroom, and closed the door behind me. That night, I slept on the couch, and ever since that day, I haven't been able to look at her the same way. Even as I lay there on the couch, trying to find some semblance of sleep, my mind refused to shut off. My thoughts raced with every possible emotion: confusion, betrayal, rage, and a deep, gnawing sadness that felt like it might swallow me whole. I remembered the early days of our relationship, the way she used to smile at me like I was the only man in the world, the inside jokes we built over years, the weekends we'd spent binge-watching bad reality shows and eating cheap takeout. All of that felt like a lie now. And it wasn't just the act itself. It was everything around it. The cover-up, the coldness, the way she brushed it off like a parking ticket. I kept asking myself, how could someone hide something like this for nearly a decade? How do you wake up every day, look your partner in the eye, and pretend everything's fine, knowing you're hiding a moment that could unravel your entire life together? I wanted to scream, I wanted to cry, but mostly I just felt hollow, like some crucial part of me had been scooped out and discarded. I didn't know how to process it. Was I supposed to forgive her just because it happened before the wedding? Did the timing really make it any less of a betrayal? And even if I wanted to forgive her, how could I when she didn't even seem sorry? By the time morning came, I hadn't slept a wink. My back hurt from the couch, but the pain was a welcome distraction. I got up early, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the mug. Elena walked in like nothing had happened, casually tying her robe and yawning. I didn't respond. I couldn't, and she didn't push it. That silence, the emptiness between us, grew louder than any fight we'd ever had. It stretched on for days. We slept in separate rooms, barely spoke, avoided each other in the hallways of our own home. And every time I looked at her, all I could see was that video, that night, that lie. How do you rebuild something when the foundation was fake to begin with? Every time she touches me now, smiles, brushes my arm, kisses my cheek, all I can think about is that video. The way she acted like it was meaningless, like it didn't matter. That image is seared into my brain, playing over and over again, like some nightmare I can't wake up from. And the worst part? She never even apologized. Not really. There was no real remorse, just indifference and deflection. I used to be someone who laughed easily, who spent hours watching dumb TikToks with my wife, joking about the future. But that guy? He's gone now, replaced by someone who second-guesses everything. After the whole Bachelorette revelation, I was shattered. Half of me wanted to pack my bags, walk out, and never look back. But the other half, the side that had been married to her for 8 long years, couldn't let go so easily. That part of me kept whispering, maybe this can be fixed. And like a fool, I listened. Elena was the one who suggested marriage counseling. At first, I took that as a good sign. Maybe she regretted what she did. Maybe she truly wanted to make things right. I told myself that if she was willing to sit down with a therapist, it meant she cared. It meant she was invested. I couldn't have been more wrong. We started seeing Dr. Fields, a soft-spoken older woman with a warm smile and a voice that reminded me of someone's wise grandmother. She created an environment that felt calm and safe, which, in hindsight, might have been the only reason I didn't completely lose my mind in those sessions. I came into the first session ready to be honest, ready to lay it all out on the table. I hoped we'd finally address what happened and maybe, just maybe, find a path forward. But before I could even speak, Elena jumped in. With a sigh so fake it made my skin crawl, she looked at Dr. Fields and said, "Marcus has been really distant and angry lately. He keeps bringing up something from years ago before we were even married." I couldn't believe it. The sheer audacity. She framed it like I was obsessing over ancient history, like I was emotionally unstable and dredging up the past for no good reason. I stared at her in disbelief, and when it was finally my turn, I didn't hold anything back. I told Dr. Fields exactly what I had found on the hard drive. I explained how Elena had hidden the truth from me for 8 years and how my trust in her had completely collapsed because of it. The whole time I spoke, Elena wouldn't even look at me. She just sat there, rolling her eyes like a teenager being lectured by a teacher. When Dr. Fields asked her directly why she hadn't told me sooner, Elena shrugged and said, I didn't think it was a big deal. It was one night." It didn't mean anything. It didn't mean anything. That phrase echoed in my head like a bell tolling at a funeral. My marriage was crumbling, my heart was in pieces, and to her it was all over something that didn't mean anything. It was like trying to put out a fire while she stood there holding the match. Things didn't get better after that. If anything, counseling became a cruel routine. Every session felt like I was living the same day over and over. I'd talk about how I felt, how I couldn't trust her, how I didn't even know who she was anymore, and she'd either tune out or mock me. She'd roll her eyes, she'd sigh, she'd act like I was making a mountain out of a molehill. One time I tried to express how ashamed I felt, how I felt like a complete idiot for never realizing what she was capable of. I opened up, hoping for a moment of connection. Instead, she laughed and said, "Well, maybe if you didn't go digging around on old hard drives, you wouldn't be so upset now." I couldn't believe the woman I married was sitting in front of me saying things like that. No empathy, no regret, just contempt. And that contempt didn't stop at therapy. It followed us home, sloped into our daily life. While I was spiraling, trying to figure out how to salvage the remains of our relationship, Alina seemed completely unfazed. She started staying out late, work dinners, drinks with friends, always some vague excuse. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. I reminded myself that my trust was already broken and maybe I was just seeing shadows where there weren't any. But slowly, I started noticing patterns. She'd get dressed up for these dinners, heels, makeup, the works, way more than she ever did for a date with me, and when I'd ask who she was meeting, her answers were always the same, just the girls. But the girls were ghosts. I checked her social media, no photos, no tags, no check-ins, nothing. One night, she came home close to midnight. I was sitting on the couch, waiting. When she walked in and saw me, she looked startled, like I had caught her in the middle of something. "Oh," she said, freezing. "You're still up?" "Yeah," I replied. "Where were you?" She paused for a second, then she said, "Just out with Chelsea. We got caught up talking." Chelsea, her best friend, is the kind of person who documents everything. If they'd been together, there would have been Instagram stories, selfies, food pics, something. But there was nothing, not a single post. That's when the suspicion stopped being a whisper and turned into a scream. I started asking myself the questions I didn't want to ask. Was she cheating again? Was she ever really sorry? Was she lying about everything? Eventually, I reached a breaking point. One night, I looked her in the eye and asked, "Are you seeing someone else?" Her reaction wasn't relief or denial, it was rage. She exploded into a full-blown meltdown. "How dare you?" she screamed, tears suddenly flowing. "I've been trying so hard to make this work, and you have the nerve to accuse me of cheating?" She stormed off and slammed the bedroom door behind her. But the outburst didn't reassure me. It only made me more suspicious. It felt performative, exaggerated, like someone caught in the act who's trying to turn the tables. The final blow came in therapy. During one of our sessions, Dr. Fields asked Alina if she felt like she was doing everything she could to rebuild trust. "I think I'm doing more than enough," she said, arms crossed. "Marcus just doesn't want to move on. He's stuck in the past. Nothing I do is ever enough for him." It was like being punched in the gut. I had been bending over backward, trying to forgive her, trying to believe in us again, and she sat there and told our therapist that I was the problem, that I was the reason we weren't healing. After that, I started keeping track of her. I'm not proud of it, but I felt like I needed answers. I checked her phone when she left it unattended. I glanced through her emails. I even started noting her car mileage. Sure enough, things didn't add up. She'd say she was going to one place, but the mileage suggested she'd been somewhere completely different, and she'd get texts from numbers I didn't recognize. Whenever I questioned the strange texts from numbers I didn't recognize, Elena would just laugh and brush it off. "It's just work stuff, Marcus. Don't be paranoid," she'd say, her tone light and dismissive, like I was being ridiculous for even asking. But I wasn't paranoid. I was aware. Aware of the lies piling up, the cracks spreading further in a marriage that already felt like it was held together with scotch tape and denial. By this point, therapy had turned into a farce. Dr. Fields continued urging us to communicate openly, to rebuild the broken bridge between us. But how do you rebuild anything with someone who's still burning the lumber behind your back? I sat in those sessions, pouring out my soul, hoping for progress. But there was nothing to build on. Elena wasn't making an effort. She didn't show up emotionally, mentally, or even logistically. She didn't even care enough to cover her tracks. By the 7th month of therapy, the truth hit me like a gut punch. I couldn't do this anymore. I stopped attending the sessions. I needed peace more than I needed reconciliation, and honestly, Elena didn't seem to mind. She didn't fight it, didn't ask why. She just stopped pretending and went back to her old, detached self. That was the moment I began seriously considering divorce. It wasn't an easy decision. I wrestled with it for weeks. You don't just walk away from 8 years of marriage without feeling like a failure. The memories, the inside jokes, the vacations, the holidays spent with each other's families, it all weighed heavily on me. But the more I thought about the life I was living, the more I realized I was stuck in something toxic. I deserved better than the constant suspicion, the cold shoulders, the lies. I deserved respect, and she had none left for me. So I made up my mind. I was going to talk to her, lay everything out. I was ready to say the words, I wanted a divorce. But, as with everything else in this roller coaster of a relationship, nothing went as planned. It was an ordinary Tuesday night. We had just finished another awkward dinner, the kind where our utensils made more conversation than we did. Elena was scrolling on her phone, lost in whatever world she preferred over mine. I sat there, turning over my words, trying to figure out the right moment to bring up the D word. And then she spoke first. "We need to talk," she said, placing her phone on the table. I froze. Those words usually meant another round of accusations, that I was clinging to the past, that I wasn't trying hard enough. I braced myself. "What now?" I muttered, already exhausted. But this time, it wasn't the usual rant. Instead, she reached into her bag and slid something across the table toward me. It took a moment for me to process what I was looking at. A pregnancy test. Positive. "We're having a baby," she said, eyes wide, waiting for me to explode with joy. I didn't. I just stared. My mind flooded with questions. This was supposed to be good news, right? But I felt nothing. Or rather, I felt everything all at once. Dread, suspicion, confusion. I couldn't ignore the thunderstorm of doubt crashing through my thoughts. "Are you sure?" I finally asked. "Yes, Marcus," she snapped, like I was a moron for even questioning it. "I've taken 3 tests. They're all positive." I sat there, numb, trying to figure out how I was supposed to react. Was I supposed to smile, to celebrate, to thank her? I couldn't. "Say something," she pressed, now clearly irritated. "I don't know what to say," I admitted, barely above a whisper. She rolled her eyes. "This is good news, Marcus. We've been trying for this." Yes, we had tried for a baby. We'd tried for a better connection, a patch to glue our failing relationship back together. But it had been months since we were truly intimate, emotionally or physically. The timing felt off, everything felt off. While Elena started diving headfirst into baby mode, looking at names, brainstorming nursery themes, pinning baby gear on Pinterest, I was drowning. She acted like this pregnancy had magically reset our relationship, like we were back to being some happy couple in a commercial. Meanwhile, I couldn't shake the question that haunted me day and night. Is this baby even mine? I didn't want to feel that way. I hated that my brain went there. But I couldn't help it. I tried to go along with it. I nodded at her ideas, tagged along to a few doctor appointments, and smiled at the ultrasound photos she showed me like they were sacred treasures. But inside, I felt like a stranger, an actor, in a role I didn't audition for. Our conversations remained shallow. Nothing meaningful was discussed. Everything we said to each other felt scripted. There was no affection, no intimacy, just logistics and superficial joy. One evening, we were sitting on the couch, and she turned to me with a glowing smile, holding up another ultrasound image. "Look," she said, "that's our baby." I forced a smile, gave a little nod, and whispered, "Yeah," but inside I felt like a fraud. I wanted to believe that picture was a symbol of our love, our bond, but all I could think was, is this really my child? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling, running through dates and memories. The last time we were intimate, it hadn't been recent. Things had been cold between us for months. Even our attempts at reconnection felt forced, like we were checking boxes rather than sharing moments. If the baby really was mine, the conception date didn't line up, not unless biology decided to bend for convenience. I wanted to confront her, to ask point blank if there was something she wasn't telling me, but I couldn't. I looked at her sleeping, a hand on her stomach, and the words stuck in my throat. She was pregnant, and it wasn't the baby's fault. Still, the questions wouldn't leave me alone, so I did what anyone in my position would do. I started researching. I looked into prenatal paternity tests. They existed, but they were expensive and invasive. Most importantly, they required the mother's cooperation, and I wasn't sure how Elena would react if I even suggested it. I wasn't ready for that war, not yet. So I waited, biding my time, watching, wondering, hoping somehow that the truth would come to light before I had to demand it. In the meantime, I tried to observe everything more closely. Her moods, her routines, her interactions. I kept mental notes of when she left the house, when she came back, how long her errands took. It wasn't just about suspicion anymore. It was about self-preservation. I needed to know whether I was being lied to all over again, this time with stakes higher than ever. She started leaving parenting books on the kitchen table, ordering baby gear online, and mentioning daycare options like we were planning the next chapter together. To her, this baby seemed like a lifeline, something to anchor our sinking ship. But I knew better. You can't plug a hole in a sinking vessel with hope and pretend it won't still go under. Every smile she gave me now felt like a mask. Every conversation about the baby was a scene in a performance I hadn't signed up for. And I felt guilty for not being able to match her enthusiasm, for questioning everything, for walking around with doubt clinging to me like a second skin. But more than guilt, I felt sad, devastated really, because even if the baby turned out to be mine, what kind of world was I bringing them into? One built on deception, on distance, on silence? I'd always dreamed of being a father. I'd imagined a life where I was someone's hero, someone's rock, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the dream I dreamed about at even nightmare. Pretending to be a miracle. So I kept waiting for the right moment, waiting for a clue, waiting for the courage to demand the truth no matter how much it might hurt. And somewhere deep down I hoped, against all logic, that maybe, just maybe, I was wrong. I told myself I'd have proof when the baby was born. Until then I'd play along, keep the peace, avoid unnecessary conflict, and wait for the moment I could act with certainty. But now, I need your advice. Am I doing the right thing by holding off? Should I confront her now, even if it risks tearing everything apart while she's still pregnant? Or am I making the smarter move by waiting until I have solid, irrefutable proof? Honestly, I don't know anymore. The only thing I was certain of was that I needed to see this through. I couldn't post or share much while the situation was unfolding, but now, with everything that's happened, I need to unpack it. The day Caleb was born was nothing short of surreal. It should have been a beautiful moment, the start of a new chapter, but for me it felt like a book I didn't want to read. One written in uncertainty, riddled with unanswered questions. Elena went into labor late at night and I rushed her to the hospital. She was in pain and lashed out at me over every little thing. How I was driving, how long it took to find parking, even how I opened the hospital door. I didn't argue back. I told myself it was the pain and pressure talking, but deep down, I knew this wasn't new. The tension had always been there. Despite all of that, the delivery went smoothly. Within a few hours, Caleb was born. A boy, a healthy, beautiful baby boy. And as the nurse placed him into my arms, I tried with everything I had to silence the doubts. I looked into his tiny face, searching for comfort, for something, anything that would tell me this was our fresh start. For a brief moment, hope stirred in my chest. Maybe things could work out after all. But that moment didn't last. As I looked closer, I noticed things that unsettled me. Caleb didn't look like me. His hair was darker, his skin tone didn't match mine or Elena's. I told myself not to panic, babies change. Genetics are complicated. But the storm of doubts I'd been carrying for months came rushing back with a vengeance. Still, I said nothing. Elena was exhausted, fast asleep shortly after the birth. I sat alone in the hospital room, holding Caleb and trying to process everything. He was innocent. Whatever the truth was, he didn't deserve the weight of my uncertainty. But I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that I didn't belong in that room the way I thought I did. I'd already planned to get a paternity test after the birth, but now I knew I couldn't wait. The hospital discreetly offered paternity testing services, and I requested one before we were even discharged. I didn't tell Elena. I couldn't, not yet. I wasn't ready for that confrontation. I needed answers first. The first few weeks at home were a haze of sleepless nights, bottle feedings, and trying to pretend everything was okay. Elena threw herself into motherhood with almost performative enthusiasm. She posted pictures of Caleb on social media, flooded her feeds with smiling selfies, and replied to every comment like we were living a fairy tale. She basked in the glow of motherhood while I was unraveling inside. I did everything I was supposed to, changing diapers, soothing cries, rocking Caleb to sleep, but it all felt hollow. I was a character playing a role, not a father holding his son. Every time I looked at Caleb, I scanned his features, looking for something. His nose, his eyes, his ears, anything that would tell me, he's yours. But I couldn't find it. Elena didn't notice my distance, or if she did, she ignored it. She seemed more interested in the validation she was getting online and from friends than the emotional reality inside our home. Anytime I tried to open up about how I was feeling, she brushed it off. "You're just overwhelmed," she'd say. "All new dads go through this." But this wasn't new dad nerves. This was existential dread. 2 weeks after Caleb was born, the test results arrived. I had been dreading the moment, but when the email came, I clicked it without hesitation. I needed to know. The words hit me like a brick. Probability of paternity 0%. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen. I'd tried to prepare myself for this outcome, but seeing it there, in black and white, was something else entirely. Final, absolute. Caleb wasn't mine. Every suspicion I'd had, the late nights, the vague explanations, the off-timing, was suddenly validated. The world I had tried to hold together with patience and denial had officially collapsed. I couldn't go home right away. I sat in my car, parked a block away, trying to breathe. I thought about Caleb, about the nights I held him, the smiles I'd faked. He didn't ask for any of this. He wasn't to blame. But Elena? She had lied. From the very beginning. That night, after Caleb finally fell asleep, I confronted her. "We need to talk," I said, my voice colder than I intended. She looked up from her phone, irritated. "What now?" I took a breath, pulled out my phone, and handed it to her. "I got a paternity test." She took the phone, and as her eyes scanned the screen, her face went pale. "You tested Caleb without telling me?" she asked, her voice cracking with indignation. "Yes," I said firmly. "I needed to know the truth." She stammered, her eyes darting away like she was searching for an exit. "Marcus, I can explain." "Explain what?" I snapped. "That you've been lying to me for months? That you let me believe this baby was mine when you knew the truth?" Tears welled up in her eyes. Once, that would have broken me. Once, I would have rushed to her side, held her, told her it was going to be okay. Not anymore. "It was a mistake," she said through sobs. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It was just one night, and I didn't know how to tell you." I stood there, numb. "Who's the father?" She didn't answer right away. She just sat there, shoulders shaking, face buried in her hands. For a long time, the only sound in the room was the low hum of the baby monitor and her muffled sobs. But I didn't move. I couldn't comfort her, not this time. I waited, giving her the silence she'd once demanded from me, but this time it spoke volumes. Eventually, she looked up, her mascara streaked, her eyes red. "It was someone from work," she finally admitted, voice barely above a whisper. I closed my eyes. Part of me already knew. Her late nights, the texts, the excuses, it all added up. But hearing her say it out loud was like a final nail in the coffin. "Do you love him?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, it wasn't like that. It was stupid. It was nothing." "But it gave us a child," I said flatly. "A child you told me was mine." She flinched. "I didn't want to lose you. I thought if I could just get through the pregnancy, we'd figure things out." "But we didn't," I said, "and now there's no fixing this." We didn't speak the rest of the night. I slept in the guest room, though I barely got a wink. My mind was on Caleb, on the innocent baby caught in the aftermath of a betrayal he didn't deserve. No matter what Elena had done, Caleb was real. He was here, and none of this was his fault. The next morning, I began looking into legal advice. Custody, rights, next steps. I didn't know what my future looked like anymore, but I knew one thing. I couldn't live a lie. And that's where I'm at now. I've got the truth, but I don't have peace, and I'm still trying to figure out how to move forward when every part of my world has been rewritten. I guess the question is, where do I go from here? Eventually, she broke down and admitted the truth. It was someone from work, a coworker she'd been seeing during the most fragile, vulnerable months of our marriage. The same months we were supposed to be rebuilding trust, when I was pouring everything I had into saving what little was left of us. Her excuses came out in a rush. She said she felt neglected. She claimed it was a mistake. She insisted she thought I'd never but none of it mattered anymore. The betrayal had already set in like rot, and no apology could undo it. In the days that followed, I met with a lawyer. It was time to end this. The lies, the games, the entitlement, it all had to stop. There was no saving us now. The marriage was over, and I was ready to fight, not out of spite, but for what was fair, and for what I finally understood was right for me. One quiet evening, after Caleb had drifted off to sleep, I sat across from Elena at the kitchen table. I had the divorce papers stacked neatly in front of me. My hands didn't shake as I slid them across the table. "This is it, Elena," I said, keeping my voice calm and even. "We're done. I can't stay in this marriage." She picked up the stack and began flipping through the pages. Her expression was unreadable at first, but when she got to the section outlining finances, her demeanor changed instantly. Her face twisted with outrage. "You're seriously leaving me with nothing?" she snapped, her voice rising. I frowned. "You're not entitled to anything, Elena. Caleb isn't my child, and you lied to me for months. I don't owe you a dime." Her eyes narrowed with fury. "You've been acting like Caleb's father this whole time. You can't just walk away now. What about child support? What about all the sacrifices I've made for this family?" I stared at her in disbelief. Sacrifices? She was the one who had torched everything, and now she was trying to spin the narrative like I was abandoning a family she chose to destroy. Elena, I said slowly, my voice steady but firm. You created this mess, not me. You cheated, you lied, and you let me believe that child was mine. I've done more for Caleb in a few weeks than his biological father probably ever will, but that doesn't give you the right to drain my bank account and rewrite history. She crossed her arms, her jaw clenched tight. You think a judge is going to see it that way? I've been a stay-at-home mom since Caleb was born. I gave up my career for this family. That was rich, coming from someone who spent most of her days scrolling Instagram and staging perfect little moments for social media clout. The version of herself she broadcast online was miles away from the reality I was living with. The weeks that followed were an exhausting blur of legal back and forth. Elena made it very clear she wasn't going down without a fight. She hired a lawyer known for playing dirty, and suddenly I was being hit with demands that defied logic. She wanted spousal support. She wanted me to cover all of Caleb's expenses. She even argued I should be held responsible for part of her medical bills from the pregnancy. Her lawyer's reasoning? Mr. Marcus acted as the father during the pregnancy and birth, and it is in the child's best interest that he continue to support the household. It was absurd. My lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who didn't tolerate games, didn't miss a beat. We'll fight this, she told me confidently during one of our early meetings. You've been deceived, and there's no legal basis for her claims. Still, the process was emotionally draining. Every time we seemed to be making progress, Elena would throw in last-minute demands. She refused to cooperate, painted me as the villain, and continued acting like I'd abandoned her and Caleb out of cruelty, rather than truth. The breaking point came during one of our court-mandated mediation sessions. We sat across from each other in a sterile conference room, each flanked by our attorneys. Elena had shown up dressed like she was attending a red carpet event, perfect hair, flawless makeup, designer everything, clearly trying to look the part of the wronged wife. I just don't understand how you can be so heartless, she said, her voice laced with manufactured emotion. After everything we've been through, you're just going to leave me and Caleb with nothing? I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. Elena, you lied to me for months. Caleb isn't my child. You don't get to play the victim here. She scoffed. You've been acting like his father. You think you can just flip a switch and walk away? Yes, I replied without hesitation. Because that's what happens when someone lies about something as life-changing as paternity. Her lawyer tried to jump in, going on about emotional bonds and continuity of care, but my lawyer cut her off. Your client has no legal grounds to demand support for a child who is not my client, she said, her voice cutting and direct. Furthermore, Mrs. Elena knowingly misrepresented the situation. This borders on fraud. Shall we pursue that angle instead? Elena's face went red. For once, she didn't have a comeback. The tide turned even further when the court ordered her to disclose the identity of Caleb's biological father. She had been ducking the question for weeks, insisting it wasn't relevant. But the judge saw through it. When she finally named him, a co-worker she had been involved with during our marital recovery, the whole room seemed to shift. The judge's expression hardened. Her credibility evaporated in seconds. Any sympathy the court might have had for her disappeared. The final ruling reflected all of that. I was found to have no financial obligation to Caleb or to Elena. No child support, no spousal support, nothing. My lawyer even succeeded in arguing that Elena's deception directly caused the breakdown of the marriage, invalidating any claim she had to post-separation maintenance. It was over, finally, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. After the ruling, I walked out of that courthouse feeling both empty and free. The freedom was undeniable. I was no longer tethered to someone who had manipulated my love and trust for her own convenience. But the emptiness, it lingered. Divorce isn't a victory, even when it's justified. It's a wound, a deep one. And even when you're the one walking away, you carry the scars. I spent the next few weeks in a strange limbo. I was technically single again, but emotionally I was still unpacking years of damage. I had to figure out who I was outside of this broken marriage, who I wanted to be moving forward. I started focusing on myself. Small steps at first. I went back to the gym, reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in years, took long walks without needing to answer to anyone. The silence at home felt unfamiliar, but it was also peaceful, something I hadn't experienced in a long time. As for Caleb, that's the part that still breaks me. I bonded with him during those first weeks of his life. I fed him, rocked him, whispered to him in the quiet hours of the night. Even now, I find myself wondering how he's doing, if he's okay, if he'll ever know the whole story. But I know I made the right decision. Staying would have meant living a lie, for both of us. Elena? She eventually stopped fighting. I think once the court made its decision, she realized the charade was over. She moved out of our home, and from what I hear, she's living with her parents for now. I don't keep tabs on her. I've blocked her on social media, cleared out old messages, and boxed up photos from a life that no longer feels like mine. I'm not bitter, not anymore. I'm just healing. And if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that the truth always matters, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. Because peace built on lies isn't peace at all. I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Elena's demands had been denied, and I was officially free. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe again without the weight of her lies pressing on my chest. Elena, on the other hand, was furious. She stormed out of the courtroom, muttering about how unfair it all was, how she deserved better, how the system was rigged. But for once, her entitlement didn't get her what she wanted. For once, the truth actually won. I'll leave you here for now, Reddit. I'll be reading your comments, and I appreciate all the support along the way. A lot has happened since I finalized my divorce from Elena. After everything was said and done, I moved out of the house and into a small but cozy apartment across town. At first, it felt strange, waking up alone, making coffee for one, sitting in the quiet. But honestly, it felt good. No more walking on eggshells, no more pretending, no more trying to hold together something that was already broken. It was just me, my space, and a chance to start over. I threw myself into work, started going to the gym again, something I hadn't done in years. Turns out, all those articles were right. Exercise really does help clear your head. I picked up hobbies I'd abandoned during my marriage. Hiking, photography, things that once made me feel alive before I got buried in Elena's drama. Friends I hadn't seen in years, friends who distanced themselves during my marriage probably because of Elena, started reaching out again, and reconnecting with them reminded me of who I was before all this happened. It felt like I was finding myself again, piece by piece. Meanwhile, Elena wasn't doing so well. A mutual friend told me that once the court forced her to name Caleb's real father, the guy completely ghosted her, transferred to another office just to avoid her. Didn't want anything to do with her or the baby. Classy. With no real support system left, Elena was scrambling. Her parents, who had backed her throughout the divorce, turned cold after learning the truth. Once they found out she'd lied to me about Caleb's paternity, they started pulling back. Financial support dried up. Emotional support went with it. For the first time in her life, she was facing the consequences of her actions, and it showed. Not that she let the world see it. On social media, she kept up the act. Strong, independent woman, loving single mom. Dozens of filtered selfies with Caleb, motivational captions, hashtags about healing and growth. But anyone who really knew her could see through it. Behind the filters was someone drowning. And of course, she tried to reach back out to me. One evening she called me. Her voice was soft, unsure. "Marcus," she said, "I've been thinking a lot. I feel like we should talk." I didn't let her finish. "There's nothing to talk about, Elena," I said flatly. She sighed dramatically, like she was the one who'd been wronged. "I know I messed up, but we had something real. Don't you miss what we had?" I almost laughed. "What we had was built on lies, Elena. I've moved on. You need to do the same." She started crying, but I wasn't falling for it, not anymore. "I wish you the best," I told her, and I hung up. A few weeks later, she showed up at my apartment. No warning, no text, just there on my doorstep, holding Caleb and looking exhausted. "Can we talk?" she asked, trying to sound composed. I didn't want a scene, so I let her in. She sat on my couch, bouncing Caleb on her knee, and launched into some speech about change and second chances, about how we could make things work, for Caleb's sake. "Marcus, I know I hurt you," she said, tears welling up, "but Caleb needs a father figure. You've always been so good to him." I stared at her, barely believing what I was hearing. "Elena, Caleb has a father, it's not me, and you don't get to use him to manipulate me into coming back." She looked at me like I'd slapped her. "You're really going to turn your back on him?" "I'm not turning my back on him," I said. "I'm turning my back on you." She left after that, but not without more tears and guilt trips. In the days that followed, she sent me long texts about how much she missed me, about how Caleb needed me, about how we could start over. I ignored most of them. When she wasn't guilt-tripping, she tried playing on my sympathy, talking about how hard it was to be a single mom, how the bills were piling up, how lonely she felt. And yeah, part of me felt bad for her. Caleb didn't ask for any of this. But that didn't mean I was going to let her drag me back into her chaos. I felt pity for her, genuine pity. She'd been so sure she could do anything, say anything, and still come out on top. But now, she was left with nothing but her consequences and a trail of burned bridges. Caleb, as much as I cared for him during those first few weeks, wasn't my responsibility. I still hope that Elena figures things out, for his sake, but I'm done being her safety net. Looking back, I'm proud of myself for walking away. It wasn't easy. There were days when I second-guessed every decision, nights when the silence was too loud. But now, seeing where I am versus where she is, I know I made the right choice. If Elena's downfall taught me anything, it's this: you can't let someone else's lies dictate your life. You don't owe your happiness to someone who destroyed your trust. Sometimes I catch myself thinking about everything that happened, how fast things spiraled, how blind I was to the warning signs, and how different my life looks now. There are moments, fleeting ones, when the silence in my apartment feels too loud. But then I remember the constant tension, the fights, the lies. I remember what I walked away from. Healing doesn't come all at once. It comes in waves. Some days I wake up feeling light, like the weight of the past is finally off my chest. Other days, a song, a smell, or an old memory sneaks up on me and drags me back. But each time it gets easier to let go. I started journaling, just a few lines every night about my thoughts, my progress, and my goals. It helps. There's something grounding about putting pain into words and watching it lose its power on the page. I've also started volunteering on weekends. Helping others has reminded me that my story isn't the worst, and that life continues even after betrayal. People have asked if I'll ever consider dating again, maybe. But for now, I'm just learning to be okay on my own, to rebuild trust in myself, in my instincts, and maybe someday, in someone else. I don't need to rush it. I've earned my peace, and I'm going to protect it. And to anyone out there who's living in the shadow of someone else's deception, know this: walking away isn't failure. Sometimes it's the bravest thing you can do.